Many students have difficulty when they're solving quadratics by factoring. So let's do an easy one and then a harder one. Okay, the first one is, a quadratic, when you go to solve it by factoring, it's in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. You always make sure your quadratic is set equal to 0. The number in front of your x squared, your coefficient is a. The coefficient in front of your x to the first power is b, and then your constant is c. So when you're solving a quadratic by factoring, and let's say we have the example x squared plus 3x minus 10 equals 0. Notice my a value is a 1 because there's a 1, understood 1 in front of my x squared. My b value is 3 and my c value is negative 10. So my a value is 1, b is equal to 3, and c is equal to negative 10. These are pretty easy to do. When the a value is 1, you want to think about what two numbers multiply to give you negative 10. They multiply to equal negative 10. And they add up to be positive 3. So what multiplies to equal negative 10 and adds to be a positive 3? So if you think about all the numbers that multiply to be negative 10, of course you have 1 and 10, where 1's positive and 1 is negative. You also have 2 and 5. Again, 1's got to be positive, 1's got to be negative. So if that's the case, we could use a negative 2 and a positive 5 because they're going to multiply to be negative 10 and they're going to add up to be positive 3. So this is going to factor with the negative 2 and the 5. It just becomes x minus 2 times x plus 5 equals 0. And of course, anytime two things multiply to give you 0, at least one of those values have to equal 0. So that means either x minus 2 equals 0 or x plus 5 equals 0. And then you solve for each one. We get x equals 2, or we could have x equals negative 5. So both of these could be our solution. Positive 2, negative 5. All right, now the difficulty comes in when you have an a value that's not a 1. All right, so let's look at this next problem. When a is not a 1, notice my a value is going to be 8. My b value is negative 2, and my c value is negative 15. So here, when my a value is not a 1, I have to think about numbers that are going to multiply to be a times c. So two numbers have to multiply to equal a times c. So that's 8 times negative 15, which is negative 120. But they have to add up to equal that b value, which turns out to be negative 2. So we're thinking about numbers that multiply to be negative 120 and add up to be negative 2. So if you think about factors of 120, again, one's going to be positive, one's going to be negative. We might have 1 times 120, okay, where one's positive and one's negative. But when you add a positive and a negative together, it's really like subtracting. And the difference between 1 and 120 is 119, which is definitely not a 2 or negative 2. Okay, we could say negative 120 is the same thing as 2 times 60, where one's positive and one's negative. And the bigger one would have to be negative for us to wind up with a negative value right here. So that's not it. 2 and negative 60 is not negative 2. 3 and 40. 3 and negative 40 is not negative 2 when you add them. 4 goes in there 30 times. 4 and negative 30 is not negative 2. 5 goes into 24 times. 5 and a negative 24, that's not negative 2. 6 goes in there 20 times. 6 and a negative 20 is not negative 2. 7 doesn't go in there. Let's see, 8 goes in there. 8 goes into negative 120, 15 times? If the 15 was negative, 8 and negative 15 is not negative 2. See, 10 goes into 120 12 times. And again, if the bigger one is negative, 10 and a negative 12 does make negative 2. This is going to be our pair where the 12 is negative. So what we do is we break up this negative 2x. We call it 10x minus 12x. Okay, and we're going to pull the rest of the problem down. So we have an 8x squared plus a 10x minus 12x. Pull down the minus 15. Okay, now we're going to do something called factor by grouping. You group the first two terms together. So we have 8x squared plus 10x plus, and then you group the last two terms together. Negative 12x minus 15. Again, this is called factoring by grouping when you have four terms. Okay, look at the first set. What evenly divides into 8x squared and 10x? What can we factor out? What's the largest amount? Well, we could take out a 2 and an x. So if you factor out 2x or divide both those terms by 2x, we're left with 4x plus 5. If we look at the next set, what's the largest amount we could take out of a negative 12x and a negative 15? Looks like negative 3. If you factor out a negative 3, that's going to leave 4x plus 5. Now notice both of these have a 4x plus 5. So we have two terms now. They both have 4x plus 5. So we're going to pull out or factor out the 4x plus 5. And what's left over is the other factor, a 2x minus 3. So that's how you factor when your A value is not a 1. Okay, it's called factoring by grouping. Now we can set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So we have 4x plus 5 equals 0. 2x minus 3 equals 0. And we'll solve each one for x. So we're going to subtract 5 from both sides, divide by 4. So one answer is negative 5/4. The other one, we're going to add 3, then divide by 2. So we have two solutions, negative 5/4 and positive 3/2. Hope this helped.